Hey, welcome back to the About the Labor podcast here at VikingsTerritory.com. I am BJ Reidell, back here with my guy, Drew Mahowald. And today, we're giving you some Vikings updates, going back on the film that we watched of the Vikings win over the Saints. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the recent moves the Vikings made. Obviously, Elijah Lee is no longer with the Vikings anymore, a little disappointing. So we'll talk about that a little bit here, and we'll talk a little bit about Anthony Barr, Sam Bradford, and the rest of the guys on the injury report, and we'll finish up, like I said, with some film analysis of what we saw upon review on the All-22 version of the film. So let's get started right away here. Note from our sponsor real quick. Black Stack Brewing, brand new brewery smack dab in the middle of Minneapolis and St. Paul with a wide range of clean and flavorful brews and a massive bright tap room perfect for intimate settings all the way to special events. Black Stack Brewing, 755 North Pryor, just north of Menards off of University Avenue. And then shout out to our sponsors over at the Twin Cities Directory. The best way to explore delicious bites and fun-filled nights that Minneapolis St. Paul have to offer. Check it out at www.twincities.directory. That's www.twincities.directory, helping you discover the real Twin Cities. All right, so first things first, the Vikings lost Elijah Lee, linebacker, 7th-round pick out of Kansas State. Today he was claimed by the San Francisco 49ers and will now play on their 53-man roster. In replacement of him, the Vikings signed former 5th-round pick linebacker Antoine Williams. He used to play for Detroit, and he played 14 games last season, 3 starts, not a whole lot of tread on his tires. So there's not a whole lot to discuss with him. He's from Georgia Southern, like Jerick McKinnon. That's about the only piece of information that I could dig up on him that was, I guess, somewhat relevant to the Vikings. The big blow here, obviously, is Elijah Lee. No longer being with the team. So if we're keeping track of the 7th-round picks now, the Vikings have now lost both Lee and Jack Tocho and have maintained Stacey Coley and Ofedi Odenigbo. So 2 of the 4 lottery tickets are gone now, Drew. What'd you think of the Vikings losing Elijah Lee to San Francisco 49ers?
Well, I guess I didn't expect it, for one. I mean, I think you can agree with me in saying that Elijah Lee didn't really show out or impress in camp or in preseason the way we kind of expected. And he didn't really get a lot of run in preseason due kind of to that. So, I don't know. I mean, I guess I'm not 100% sure. I didn't watch this 49ers game, so I don't really know what their situation's like But looking at the preseason game, week 3, that second half, that defense got drilled. And those linebackers got drilled by both Taylor Heineke and Case Keenum. So I'm sure they could use some rangy, athletic play at the linebacker position, and Elijah Lee can definitely give that to him. So
yeah, Elijah Lee, like you said, didn't play very well this summer. He was kind of cast over for Eric Wilson, who ended up making the roster and is still with the team. It's disappointing to see that Elijah Lee is no longer with the Vikings anymore, given that the talent that we have discussed in the past, the potential. But we issued fair warning if the Vikings were to cut a player like him or Tashawn Bauer, for example, that there are teams like the San Francisco 49ers who don't have a whole lot of talent on their roster and can afford to, sweep up high-end talent, guys that have a ton of potential that could add to their roster in the future when they're ready to compete, like Elijah Lee. So while I'm somewhat surprised at the Vikings lose Elijah Lee now as opposed to the week prior, I'm not exactly shocked given the place that he ended up landing, given what we've seen from San Francisco, and given the fact that we all know that they're in the middle of a rebuilding phase, and it's probably going to take them a couple of years, and this is just part of that. So disappointing to see that we won't be able to see Elijah Lee develop in a Vikings uniform, but of course we wish him the best, and hopefully he'll be able to shine a little bit brighter in San Francisco than he did during his time in Minnesota. So from there, let's go over some of these injury notes here. Before we do that, Bucky Hodges, the Vikings' 6th-round pick, so another lottery pick per se. He also went unclaimed through waivers, so in theory, the Vikings could have added him to their practice squad and elected not to do so. I guess, what do you think of this, Drew? Any thoughts on Bucky Hodges potentially coming back? Do you care? Should Vikings fans care? What do you think?
I'm surprised he cleared waivers. I really thought his upside as a receiving weapon was going to be enough to entice a team to claim him, but sounds like what I've kind of interpreted based on what he showed in preseason training camp with the Vikings, or where the Vikings used him, is that they really wanted to see some improvement, some development as a blocker. They didn't really line him up outside as a receiver or in the slot, or however he wasn't out wide as a receiver in comparison to how many times he was at tight end in line, which kind of showed me, okay, they want this guy to be a blocker, and he must not have showed that, at least to them. They weren't impressed. I wasn't impressed myself, but the coaching staff must feel the same way. So they went out and got a guy who can block in Blake Bell. They kept Kyle Carter on the team who can block, or on the practice squad who can block. So I think there's a pretty clear emphasis on your tight ends being able to block and being, there's that whole emphasis on run blocking and getting the run game going again. Bucky Hodges wouldn't fit that kind of mantra, that attitude. So I don't really think he'll be brought onto the practice squad. They have Kyle Carter there for a reason. So, but I am surprised that he cleared waivers because, again, while the Vikings kind of favor the blocking tight end, type of player, other teams could use a receiving weapon like him, I assume, and I figured a team would claim him.
Yeah, I kind of figured a team would claim him too. Possibly the team that the Vikings just finished off with, New Orleans. You'd think that Sean Payton would be able to find a way to use Bucky Hodges next to Kobe Fleener, but I don't know. Maybe Bucky Hodges is more raw than we're even giving him credit for.
Yeah.
Because it does seem strange that he would, first of all, fall all the way to the 6th round. I think a lot of Vikings fans were very surprised that were able to land him where they did. And then second of all, it's surprising to see that nobody wants him even after. You don't have to use a pick to get him anymore, and nobody wants him. So there's something to this, I'm sure. I can't imagine Bucky Hodges won't get a shot somewhere, someplace, at some point here, and maybe he'll end up in a Vikings training camp next year, and leave a better impression and find a way onto this roster in the future. But for now, this is the end of Bucky Hodges, and this is I guess. We're moving on with the tight end group that we have right now, and Kyle Rudolph, David Morgan, Blake Bell. There's a lot of size, a lot of strength, and a lot of versatility within those three. So, regardless of how much you love Bucky Hodges, I understand he was a charismatic guy and an intriguing player moving forward. But this tight end depth chart is very solid. We saw reps from all three players. I think even Blake Bell got in there for 2 snaps against New Orleans. So, this is a well-rounded group, and I think we should be pretty satisfied with this depth chart. And even though they weren't, the tight ends weren't exactly a focal point against New Orleans, we did see these guys do some good things. Obviously, Kyle Rudolph has the touchdown. Blake Bell, like we said, was in there for a couple snaps, didn't do anything
David
bad.
Morgan against the run.
David Morgan, yeah.
Making some plays, yeah.
Making some plays. So, tight end group seems fine without Bucky Hodges. Vikings are ready to move on without him, and I think we are too. So, let's move on here to the injury notes that I mentioned before. Anthony Barr, obviously, sat out of practice on Wednesday afternoon. Sam Bradford, limited. I saw Emmanuel Lemur, linebacker, hurt his hamstring, it sounded like. He was also limited. But for the most part, it sounds like the Vikings are pretty healthy. What do you have to think of the injury report today?
I would like to clarify, well, not clarify, but I'd like to voice my opinion here and say that I think both the Bradford and Barr injuries are very precautionary. I think Bradford might not even have a knee injury at all. It might just be one of those things where they give this guy, a veteran who put up the performance of his career on Monday night, they might just be giving him some rest, a day off, quote unquote, another one. So I think that's what that is. Anthony Barr, I'm sure he nicked up a hamstring, maybe pulled it a little bit during the game, but I'm sure he'll be good to go Sunday. Also, we're of note, though, Tremaine Brock, full practice today with that groin injury, sat out against the Saints.
Yes.
I would assume having him back will be, if they do intend to put him in the slot, I would assume he'll see a lot of Antonio Brown on Sunday. So that's big as well. And it sounds like, I think he told either Thomason or somebody in the media that he'll for sure be out there. So good to have him back. And though Mackenzie Alexander did play pretty well Monday night, I think Brock is still, I think, the more reliable option in the slot there. So
yeah, definitely good to see Tremaine Brock back. Like Drew just said, even if Mackenzie Alexander did play well, it can never hurt to be at full strength on your back end when they're at a position where you can get beat and things can change real quickly. So it's nice to see Tremaine Brock back, having him to fortify a position that was a concern, at least heading into New Orleans, and I guess maybe less of a concern now after seeing what Mackenzie Alexander was able to do, and not, Alexander wasn't great by any means, but he did enough. So it is nice to add Brock back there. It gives you another dimension. It gives you another playmaker. He's a guy that can make things happen with the ball in the air. We saw his ball skills when he was with the 49ers. So it's good to have him back. Maybe, he's the difference between creating a turnover and not next week. So that's certainly good news. Sam Bradford, I'm with you all the way. I think that this is just a way for him to not have to,
practice. That's what they did with Brett Favre basically every single week when he was a Viking. He was probable on the injury report every single week just because he didn't want to practice.
Yeah.
So
yeah. It's like a loophole. It's a loophole in the system right now for the Vikings to basically give their guy an extended rest period with because he played well, because he's a veteran, whatever it is. We see this with Brian Robinson and Terrence Newman all the time as well. So I'm not shocked to see Sam Bradford out there. Little concerned about Anthony Barr, given that it seems like he's always on the injury report. That's always kind of, a scare with him, given that, if he is injured, put it this way, last season a lot of what we've talked about with Barr's struggles were directly related to some sort of injury that we didn't have an answer to, and we actually didn't know for certain that he was injured or not. But just the point being here, the fact that it's now in the air that Anthony Barr is injured does concern me a little bit, because he is a really big piece of this defense. But at the same time, we'll know later on this week, I'm sure, whether or not he's practicing with the team and whether or not he'll be able to go against Pittsburgh. But he's an important piece this weekend against Pittsburgh, because Jesse James, their tight end, has really stepped up and is starting to look a little bit more like Heath Miller, who he was trying to replace a couple years back when he was drafted to Pittsburgh. So the Vikings definitely could use Anthony Barr's presence to neutralize that aspect of their offense. Obviously, they've got so many other offensive playmakers that it's important to have your best guys out there in order to stop a passing offense that is probably going to end up at some point this season becoming very lethal and potentially record-breaking with all that talent out there. So it's important for Anthony Barr to get back out there, but until we hear more, I wouldn't worry too much about it. But so moving on from the injury stuff, let's talk a little bit more about the New Orleans game. We went back and did some film review, try to get a better gauge of who played well on Monday night, and try to get an understanding of get a better understanding of the grades that we saw from PFF. I'm sure that if you're someone that likes to look at those grades, there's a couple of them that help you raise your eyebrow to this past week here. Just overall trying to get a better understanding of what went down against New Orleans.
Right.
So we did that. I know that you want to talk about Harrison Smith, so why don't you get us started? Tell me about his performance against New Orleans.
This is one PFF grade I do agree with, actually. They gave him a 90.4, which is actually an elite grade for them. So, there is a lot of things that Harrison Smith does, and we say this all the time, but I think this is a classic example of this game in general of what he does that it does not show up in the box score. Whether it was simply setting the edge for a run that, for example, Eric Kendricks would make a tackle for a yard loss, or it would be Tom Johnson sneaking in there to make the tackle, or somebody else that would get the actual tackle stat, a tackle for loss. But Harrison Smith setting the edge and making the play initially is what caused that to happen. I think there was one in particular where it was the Saints were in the red zone, and Smith timed the blitz perfectly, and all he did was just slam himself into the right tackle. And I believe it was Strife was still in the game. Just fell backwards about 3 feet. And Alvin Kamara, I believe, ran right into his feet, essentially, and then in came Tom Johnson for the tackle. So stuff like that from Harrison Smith, it doesn't show up on the box score, and it's not something most general NFL fans will notice or see. But it's something that needs to be appreciated, because very few safeties do that. And then I also wanted to say that, he took away primary reads multiple times down the seam when he would look for Fleener. Drew Brees looked for Kobe Fleener on a few seam routes over the middle as kind of the initial read, and Smith was there for those. It's just there's so much, and obviously I think the one pass breakup he had to
Michael Thomas,
I believe. Yeah, I was looking for Michael Thomas, and Smith came out of nowhere essentially to break that one up. So this guy, he's one of the elite safeties, if not the best safety in the NFL. I think we know that. But we always say that it's about what he does that doesn't show up in the box score, because last year he didn't record an interception.
Right.
So people might look at that as a down year when really he was just doing everything he usually does. He just wasn't there for the interceptions, but he made, he's setting the edge on the runs. He's stopping plays. He's doing things that don't show up in the box score consistently, taking away primary reads. He like that video, I think, from Brett Coleman, and you should check that out on YouTube, by the way, if you haven't, where he compares Harrison Smith to Troy Polamalu. He does everything. He's the ignition for this Vikings defense, because wherever he lines up, it sets the tone for the Vikings. So I just think this game was a perfect example of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Harrison Smith has been, the guy on the Vikings back end for, essentially since he was drafted in 2012, right? The question marks early on in his career were primarily injury and durability related, but when he's on the field, granted, this is a guy that probably needs to get into the habit of playing 16 games instead of 14 games throughout an NFL season. But when he is on the field, he's as good as anyone. He's as lethal as anyone, and he's as versatile as anyone. He does so many different things for the defense that, like you said, they don't show up in the box score. Just being a tone setter out there, being a leader, knowing exactly what's going on, and just playing his keys, his instincts. The guy is as instinctual as any safety in the NFL right now. So while he may not be someone that shows up in the box score, it's specifically last season with interceptions, but he's always in position to make a play. You talk about that Michael Thomas pass breakup. That's a play where he gets the ball. He gets the ball at the highest point and he pops it up in the air, and it potentially could have been someone else's interception. Obviously, the Vikings were unable to capitalize on that, but that's the type of player that Harrison Smith is. Obviously, had that ball been intercepted by someone else, you wouldn't see in the box score that Harrison Smith was the guy that caused that play. So
the Saints' rushing attack was stalled, more often than not. I think they had less than 3 yards of carry. And you're going to get, Linval Joseph obviously deserves a lot of credit for that. Tom Johnson played well against the run. But Harrison Smith, on these outside runs when the Saints attempted them, he was usually the guy that would contain that, bring it back inside to where Eric Kendricks, Anthony Barr, Tom Johnson, these guys could make that tackle. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. I don't think he gets a lot of credit for it sometimes, especially from the national media. We know that. But he's one of the best all-around, multifaceted safeties in the NFL.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you on that. Let's hop back over to the offensive side of the football here. So I spent a lot of time watching the offensive side of the ball this week, obviously because the offense was so prolific. I thought it was pretty interesting, first of all, that the Vikings got off to such a slow start, and then you saw them really take off at the end of the first half, right? So how about that 2-minute drill? We talked about on the last show here how Sam Bradford was able to complete 3 basically elite throws in a row to get a touchdown.
Yeah.
We didn't talk about the fact that came in the 2-minute drill, right? He was backed up inside his own 15-yard line, and it was a couple runs to Dalvin that didn't really go anywhere. Sean Payton's calling the timeouts. Thank you, Sean Payton. And as the drive progressed here, Shurmur decided to kind of opened it up a little bit, gave the Vikings an opportunity to get themselves some points at the end of the half, and Sam Bradford ends up drilling Adam Thielen. He makes that throw to Jarius Wright that you love so much, that we all should appreciate, and then he hits Stephon Diggs in the back of the end zone for a touchdown. So I just want to point out that you look back at that drive, and obviously it was great live, but looking back at it through the All-22 lens, seeing what Sam Bradford was able to accomplish against defenses that were, designed to stop him within 2 minutes. These are defenses that are going to give you some room for give themselves some room for error, and essentially are trying to prohibit the big play from happening. Well, we saw the big play happen probably 3 times. I mean, the touchdown to Diggs was 18 yards, the reception to Jarius Wright was 21 yards, and the Adam Thielen catch was 30-plus for sure. So Saints trying to contain the big play, and the Vikings continuously ripping big play after big play off during the 2-minute drill on a drive that quite very easily could have decided the fate of this game based off when that touchdown came.
I think we need to we need to learn a lesson from this situation. First of all, if you're the Saints defense and you're coaching the Saints, do not get greedy in the situation. Do not call those timeouts, Sean Payton. That is, I could not, especially when after the second down run by Cook to make it, I think it was like 3rd and 1. He calls timeout there, as if the chances are much higher that the Vikings fail that 3rd and 1, which last year was probably the case. But you have Dalvin Cook now, and you have a running back that falls forward every time. You have a Saints defense that is very subpar, and you're calling a timeout with over a minute to go. I mean, man, I was laughing at that when it happened, and I'm glad Pat Shurmur and company, who I'm going to talk about next, by the way, but Pat Shurmur turned it on and made him pay for that. So that was a big swing in this game, because I believe the possession before that was the one where, I think you mentioned this today on Twitter, where Bradford had the toss that was it was the throw into the end zone where Cook was intended for Cook, and it was knocked up into the air. And if the Saints pick that off, we're looking at a completely different football game probably. But between that and then Sean Payton's dumb timeouts, we had the essentially what's probably a 10-point swing.
Yeah, and that's a huge difference too. Simply because that could have been prevented by better game management for Sean Payton or better execution when Sam Bradford basically threw that ball in between the 9 and the 7 on Cameron Jordan's chest, the ball that got popped up in the air. That was probably a dumb decision.
I think he predetermined his throw there. I think he wasn't expecting the zone, Jordan to drop back in zone, and
why should he have?
Right, but that's exactly what bit him in the butt last year against the Redskins on that game-losing interception. So
linebacker drop it. It was Preston Smith dropping into coverage on the left side of the formation for that during that game.
Pass rusher dropping back. Yeah.
So, I guess it doesn't burn the Vikings this time, but you hope. I imagine Sam Bradford probably looked back at that play like, yeesh, like that's something I can't let happen.
That's what he's a rhythm passer. When especially in this Pat Shurmur offense, it's easy to get into a rhythm. When you have those 3-step and 5-step throws, and then bam, you're releasing the football. And I mean, I'm going to relate this to Madden when it's not really that similar, but like this happens. When you get into a rhythm, and then you kind of expect things to be there, and then your opponent drops into a coverage you didn't expect. If he's playing man the whole time. And then you get into a guy that drops your lineman back in coverage, it throws you off, and you assume it's there, and by the time you realize it's there, it's too late. So, but it's a minor thing that I'm not terribly concerned with, but there can be some severe repercussions, as we saw last year against the Redskins, and possibly, or I guess could have seen against the Saints, but it never happened.
Absolutely. So let's talk about Pat Shurmur now. I know that you want to talk about him with your film, so why don't you get us started here? But I thought he called a heck of a game. He called a great game, with exception to maybe 3 or 4 calls, in my opinion. So let's see what you have to say.
Obviously that reverse the Diggs is the one to kind of knock on his. That was a hilarious play call, but he was very good. He called a very well-balanced game. He stuck with the run, even though it's got off to a slow start.
Yes.
And he did call some things down the field, realizing that the Saints were playing man it seemed like almost exclusively in this game. I was probably 75% man defense, and you have Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs. You can really get aggressive there. But what I noticed in his passing scheme for that game, it looked like Sam Bradford's progressions through the entire game on probably 90% of the play calls was from right to left. So he would go back to pass. I mean, think about all the completions he made. So many of them were on the right side, or on guys that started on the right side of the field that were running routes across to the left side. Think about those first 2 completions to Diggs on the drag routes and the mesh concept. You think about Thielen and the right slot moving on that 4 verts over the middle to the left. You think about the touchdowns to Diggs, both of them. I mean, it seems like, I don't know if that was the matchups they wanted with Thielen and Diggs on the right side against those specific DBs, but it looked like Sam Bradford and Shurmur both got comfortable starting their progressions on the right side, moving to the left, and that's why you saw Laquan Treadwell on the left side, who, I mean, he was the X on the left side there the entire game. He played like 35, 40 snaps, so it's not like he wasn't on the field, but he was running routes and was getting open, but he just wasn't in the progression.
Right.
He was last in the progression because they started right, moved left, because, I mean, I'm guessing they liked the matchups with the Saints DBs on the right side in that man coverage, so they tried to exploit that as best they could, and it worked.
Well, if you think about it, from a quarterback's perspective too, right? If you're a right-handed thrower, you're going to drop back with your back to, quote, the left side of the field.
Right. Yeah.
And it just makes sense for your arm angle to be able to, the throws to the right side, if you're dropping back as a right-handed passer, are just naturally going to feel easier. You're probably going to be able to get a little bit extra mustard on throws to that way. And obviously throwing back across your body is like a mortal sin as a quarterback, Mr. Brett Favre. So, it makes sense that it would work out this way. I think that it's funny because if Riley Reiff isn't protecting as well as he did, he was absolutely phenomenal. I have him down for 0 pressures, 0 quarterback hits, 0 sacks allowed, basically a nothing burger from Riley Reiff. If you get that type of protection, you can absolutely do that. You can go through your progressions on one side of the field all night long knowing that your blind side is protected. So that's probably something where the Vikings came out, like you said, they liked their matchups better on the right side of the field. But as they noticed that the Saints weren't getting any pressure off the left side, Riley Reiff's side, obviously Cameron Jordan was on Mike Remmers for the majority of this game, and the Saints don't exactly have a ton of pass rushers beyond Cameron Jordan, so Vikings probably felt more and more comfortable as the game went on with what was going down on the left side of their line. And, I mean, why wouldn't they start the reads off on the right side of the field then? And Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs did a great job of creating separation early in their routes, creating separation at the stem of their routes, being in certain places when Sam Bradford wanted them to be there. I mean, there is, at least for sure on the Kyle Rudolph touchdown, we saw that ball basically being in Kyle Rudolph's hands just as he turned his head on that corner route. So there's a ton of timing routes going on here. Basically, it seemed like, based off of what you're talking about here, based off what I was able to notice as well, that Pat Shurmur once they got into a rhythm, they just started to kind of feel out the situation, and they used their chemistry. And this is the Vikings offense that has played together much longer than many of these Saints defenders have played together. And the Vikings simply beat them with experience and chemistry up and down the field. And they, executed the game plan very well based off of the keys that they were able to see. So Pat Shurmur, called a great game with exception to that reverse play that you mentioned. Right. That was that's a play where I know a lot of people were like, well, if it had worked, we probably would have loved it. But no, I don't like that play call because of the timing of the play call. Yes, if it had worked, that would have been great. But the timing of the play call was way off. There's absolutely no need for trickery at that point. The Vikings offense was rolling. They were doing things both well in the run and the pass. I mean, there was no need for a reverse play at that time, and you lose 6 yards. That's as good as a sack on first down. So that's the one play call that sticks out in my mind as one that, not great. I don't like a couple of, I guess I don't love the idea of throwing a slant to Dalvin Cook over the middle of the field when you're in the red zone. I mean, that does kind of sound like a recipe for disaster. It sounds a lot like it was the same style that got the Seattle Seahawks in trouble against the New England Patriots during the Super Bowl. I mean, that type of play, you're throwing a ball to one guy when there's a ton of guys from the other team in that same area. So it's got to be a perfect pass, otherwise it gets popped up, and you more than likely are going to see that play get intercepted. I mean, the Vikings were lucky here, but I don't love that play call either. But for the most part, I thought that Pat Shurmur did a ton of really good things, and at least for one more week, he'll have people being more say kind things about his play calling as opposed to the opposite, which is something that we've kind of seen consistently since he took over for Norv Turner. People haven't really been thrilled about the play calling style of Pat Shurmur, but he did a great job mixing up pass and run very well, mixing up short, intermediate, and long throws in this game, and we saw Sam Bradford execute it basically to perfection.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's clear these two have like that, built that rapport, and they've really connected over the offseason. And people got concerned about in the preseason not they didn't get off to a flying start by any means. It was 11 or 12 possessions with 3 points to show for it. But you start to unleash things in the regular season. I think we talked about that plenty of times where teams aren't going to show their hand in preseason. So, but yeah, that was just that Shurmur thing was just something I had noted. It's just I expect kind of the same thing going forward here, as long as they get good matchups with these DBs. It seems like a lot of teams have their top DB on that right side, which would be the left side of the offensive side. So, it's one way to beat guys. It's creating matchups and using them to your advantage, and that's I think exactly what the Vikings did, especially with Adam Thielen in the slot, because when they did not have man coverage, he was generally going against linebackers in zone, which he's going to win that every day. I think that on one of those long passes over the middle, Manti Te'o was up playing, defending Adam Thielen, which is almost insulting. So, you have to take advantage of that.
Right. Absolutely. So, let's talk a little bit more about the offense here, specifically Dalvin Cook and Stephon Diggs, who, for me, like you said, Adam Thielen was a big piece of what was going well for the Vikings offense, spreading the field. But then the complementary pieces of Stephon Diggs, obviously Diggs stepped it up a ton in catching traffic situations and also in the red zone. And Dalvin Cook seemed to get stronger as the game went on. So Dalvin Cook specifically, we saw him getting those 3, 4, 5 yard runs, kind of getting stalled at the line of scrimmage, probably more often than he would have liked early on. But as the game went on, as the Vikings were able to open up the passing game a little bit, this is another plus to Shurmur, by the way, another credit to him for figuring out a way to have this basically to execute their game plan better, I guess, as the game went on. But as the passing game opened up the running game, we saw Dalvin Cook start opening it up, and we saw him, having success specifically as a shotgun runner. I believe it was both of his 30-yard rushes. He had the one of 33 that was kind of the nail in the coffin, then also the 32-yard rush as well that set the tone. Was it late in the third or something, early in the fourth quarter or something like that? But how about being able to run out of the shotgun again? The Vikings legitimately can run the football out of single back, I form. They ran some wing T, some with 2 running back and 2 tight end sets, 22 personnel, if you will. They showed all kinds of looks running the football with Dalvin Cook, and for the most part, they had success running through every gap that they tried. They had success running outside zone with Mike Remmers to the right side. They had success on the left side with Riley Reif. They had success running inside zone up the gut, whether it was between Elflein and Berger, or Berger and Remmers, or Easton when he was in there, and Easton and Elflein as well. The Vikings were simply finding room to run more often than not as the game progressed. So I guess this is sort of an extension of what we saw from Pat Shurmur, but at the same time from Dalvin Cook, his vision, being able to, quote, get skinny through those holes and make some bigger plays as the game progressed and really wear down that Saints defense was a huge key to victory for me.
Yeah, exactly. Having a running game in general, for one thing, is nice. I think last year at this, what was it, 3 yards a carry last year?
How many 100-yard rushers did we have last year? Did we only have the one? Was it Jerick McKinnon against the Giants last year? Was that the one time we had a 100?
He didn't get to 100 that game. I don't think. Not?
Was it against the Bears?
I don't think he did.
So the Vikings.
Was there one at all last year? I might have to check this out now.
I'll look right now. You talk.
I don't remember one. McKinnon had 85 yards against the Giants. I remember that specifically because I remember for the longest time that was the most successful, rushing performance of the season. But point here is the Vikings need a running attack, and that's part of the reason why. There's a lot of reasons to get a whole new offensive line, but that was certainly one of them. So you bring in Mike Remmers, just a mauler on the right side. You bring in, Pat Elflein, and you bring in Nick Easton to shore up the middle. And while I think they did struggle a little bit against the run, they did figure things out as the game went on. And you saw that kind of that continuity, start to click in the second half, and you saw holes open up. You saw guys communicating better with their blocks and shifting guys over and whatnot. So, very encouraging there. That definitely helped Bradford in his performance too, because Shurmur stuck with the run, trusted it. The offensive line performed, and when you get a guy, 22 carries for 127 for Dalvin Cook, so that's 5 yards a carry, over 5 yards a carry. It's not gonna hurt your offense, that's for sure.
Yeah, so the Vikings last season, they only went over 100 yards rushing as a team 2 times last year. against New York, and against Chicago to close out the season. So one game that was essentially garbage time during the regular season.
Yard rush.
No,
they didn't have an individual.
Yes, Dalvin Cook is the first individual 100-yard rusher for the Vikings in quite some time.
I'm trying to think even too, going back to 2015, because Peterson, the last how many games didn't do that. That's an interesting stat. I'll have to look that up here.
Yeah, that's That's probably something that we can we'll update you guys on that statistic as we know more. We'll call it a developing story from the About the Labor podcast. But it's been a while since the Vikings have had a 100-yard rusher, and Dalvin Cook obviously able to accomplish that in his debut. And if you didn't already know this, I'm sure it's been floating around, so most people probably are aware of this, but Dalvin Cook actually had more rushing yards in his debut than Adrian Peterson did. He passed Adrian Peterson's 107-yard mark, I believe, in his debut with that final 33-yard rush. So good on Dalvin. It seems like the Vikings probably have something special there. He's actually number 2 in the NFL behind Kareem Hunt in total rushing yards after week 1. Sam Bradford, by the way, just for the record, is number 2 in passing yards behind Alex Smith. So I'm sure everyone expected the Vikings and the Chiefs to have the top offenses coming out of week 1. I'm sure that that was what all the experts predicted. But, it's interesting, it's fun, and now we're on to Pittsburgh. So let's talk a little bit about the Pittsburgh Steelers. Obviously, we'll get more into Pittsburgh on the next show now, which will be up on Friday, I believe. But we'll do a little brief kind of preview of the preview, so to speak. A little bit redundant, but we'll work with it. So what do you – just initial thoughts? Vikings against the Steelers, they're playing in Pittsburgh. Let me first get your initial take. It's Wednesday as we record this. Do you think the Vikings have a fighting chance against this high-powered Steelers offense?
Oh, they have a fighting chance. I think they're built very similarly to the Saints. I think their defense presents more of a challenge in that it's a 3-4. They get a lot more creative with blitzes and disguising things. So that will present a challenge a little bit to this young and kind of still, again, an offensive line that doesn't have the continuity yet. But I think that the one thing I'm taking away right now is that people are kind of hyping up this Antonio Brown versus Xavier Rhodes matchup, and I don't think it's going to be a thing.
They're from the same hometown. They know each other. They're brothers. Of course it's going to be the narrative.
We've talked about this before. Xavier Rhodes is not, as far as we know, going into the slot. Maybe he'll travel with Brown to both sides on the outside.
We did see Xavier Rhodes move completely across the formation on Monday against Michael Thomas, but we did not see him go into the slot, from what I could see.
Yeah, if I'm Pittsburgh, I'm throwing Brown in the slot as much as possible and forcing Tremaine Brock or Mackenzie Alexander, or Terrence Newman, or whoever it is, to step in there and try and guard the best receiver in the league.
Newman was not great, by the way. Newman was not great working out of the slot. So
yeah, absolutely. So that's, I really don't see this Brown versus Rhodes matchup being a real thing, and I think Antonio Brown is going to be a serious problem. And I think despite what we know, we saw Michael Thomas put up pedestrian numbers, but I think Brown's in for another big day because out of the slot, the Vikings, I can't think of an answer that I trust to defend him.
Well, let's be real. Even if it was Xavier Rhodes versus Antonio Brown all night long on the outside, you still expect Antonio Brown to get his to some extent, right? That's just the player that Antonio Brown is. He's the best route runner in the NFL. There's a reason why we say that Stephon Diggs is like the light version of Antonio Brown, or like a carbon copy that will one day be like Antonio Brown. It's because they have very similar styles. And if you know Stephon Diggs' style, which I'm sure most Minnesota fans do at this point, it's being a savvy route runner, using your head well to kind of adjust your routes and create space, and being a smart receiver, knowing the spots on zones. Antonio Brown is as good as anyone in the NFL. It's finding the soft spot in zone coverage and basically just setting up shop for Brendan Roethlisberger, who has a cannon for an arm and can fit it into tight windows if Brown simply creates enough space to get himself open. That's the type of player he is. the Steelers use Antonio Brown very similarly to how the Vikings use Stephon Diggs. The difference being here is that they also have Martavis Bryant and they have Le'Veon Bell, who the Vikings obviously hope that Dalvin Cook is going to be in the same mold as Le'Veon Bell, I guess, being a pass-catching running back. He struggled a little bit last week catching balls out of the backfield, but he was moved into the slot a couple times. I think I saw Dalvin Cook split out a couple different times. We saw that for sure during training camp and stuff like that. So he is in that same mold as Le'Veon Bell or David Johnson, if you will, rest in peace. But, I think that the Vikings have enough. If Anthony Barr is healthy, because Anthony Barr will be big containing both Jesse James and Le'Veon Bell out of the backfield. If he is healthy, same could be said about Eric Kendricks, by the way, who will be in charge of both players as well to some extent. I think the Vikings have enough to contain Martavis Bryant, because I think we'll probably be seeing Xavier Rhodes on Bryant most of the time. If Brown is in the slot, Rhodes is going to be on Bryant. That's pretty much, par for the course right there. And then we'll see Trey Waynes on Eli Rogers, who is their guy that runs, the streak routes, the 9 routes down the field that, Tommy Lee Lewis or Willie Snead were the guys running in New Orleans. So I think the Vikings match up pretty well. Obviously, they're going up against their second Hall of Fame quarterback in as many weeks, so there's, inherent challenges that come with that. But as always, if the Vikings defensive line, which is still stacked, still creating pressure, is able to get to Ben Roethlisberger, he's not nearly as mobile as he used to be. He's had a ton of injuries to his lower extremities over the course of his career. And they have, the girth in Linval Joseph and Danielle Hunter and Everson Griffin to take down a big quarterback that generally takes 2 guys to take him down. It's been, it's the reason why we call him Big Ben, right? Because he's required extra help for his entire career. But the Vikings have some real big bodies. Anthony Barr could be thrown in the same conversation. I think the Vikings match up pretty well. I think the fact that they're playing on the road is something to be concerned about. I agree with you, Drew, that they have a fighting chance here, but I think it would be too homerish for me to say at this point that I expect the Vikings to walk into Heinz Field and get a W. I think that they're going to have an opportunity to do so. I don't have a problem betting on the Vikings if that's your thing. I think this is a team that could earn an upset victory here. But let's keep in mind that this is a Steelers team that many expect to be at least in the AFC Championship, if not the Super Bowl this year. So this is a real test for the Vikings. And for example, if they do lose this game, I'm not saying they will, knock on wood, but if they do, this is by no means a bad loss. This is a very difficult team that they're going up against here, and quite possibly could be the most difficult team. The best team that they face this season. Green Bay, obviously in the running, Atlanta, obviously in the running as well. But this is probably one of the toughest tests they're going to see all season long. Yeah,
I'm not going to predict a win in this game, despite Pittsburgh did kind of barely crawl past Cleveland this past weekend, but there's so many weapons on that offense. Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown are arguably the top 2 skill position players in the NFL there.
I would make the argument that Le'Veon Bell is the best running back. David Johnson is the best fantasy running back.
Right. I agree with that.
So Bell is the best running back. I personally still believe Antonio Brown is the best wide receiver. A lot of people will argue with me and say that Julio Jones is. Fair argument. I'm not going to tell you you're wrong, but I still assess Antonio Brown as the number 1 receiver. Yeah. So to your point, they are the number 1 receiver and the number 1 running back as far as I'm concerned in the NFL.
Right. So I think they can. The thing about Ben Roethlisberger is that a lot of times pressure doesn't really phase him, and he's big enough where it's very hard to bring him down. But I do think he will at times try and do more than he needs to, or try to do way too much and make the really tough throw, kind of like Brett Favre would do sometimes. So there is that I think could help the Vikings. But initially, I don't see a Vikings win. I do see a big day though for the Vikings offense again. I saw a stat today on Twitter about Joe Hayden, and how the last 3 years he's been, I think it was the 8th worst among cornerbacks that are qualified for the stat. He was 8th worst in yards allowed per snap, coverage snap, and then 3rd worst in passer rating allowed. Yeah, something like that. And it's like, all right, and I'm assuming he'll line up on, the defense's left side, Diggs' right side. That's where he lined up every single snap this past week against the Browns, which would line him up against Stephon Diggs. So I like that matchup a lot, and I think Diggs is in for a big day if that's the case.
I like the matchups for all of our wide receivers heading into this game. Pittsburgh has the Steelers have a lot of players, and like I said, this is something we'll talk about more on the next show, upcoming show here. This is meant to be kind of a tease for that. The Steelers have a ton of players that on the defensive end who might be very good players in a couple of years here, but they were forced to rebuild 1 or 2 years back. Obviously, they have a different defensive coordinator now. It's Keith Butler there. I think a lot of people are still used to the Steelers' defense of old, whereas this is a different 3-4 unit. Now it's guys like Stephon Tuitt, Cameron Hayward being the big namers. You got Bud Dupree and Ryan Shazier, who are both linebackers who have their faults, I guess, primarily Bud Dupree, who can't bend at all around the line, and he'd be a guy that probably would get a whole lot more sacks if he was able to contort his body better around offensive tackles. But there are limited players here. TJ Watt is a rookie, obviously. You can't expect him to be, the wrecking ball that he was in college just yet. James Harrison is 4,000 years old. He's from the Cretaceous period, so I think it's, we've got to be getting.
Doesn't look like it though.
Yeah, it doesn't look like it sometimes, but at the same time, you have to expect, an aging linebacker to be able to get. You can expose that type of player in coverage. He's got to get him matched up on a guy like Stephon Diggs, and it's game over, or a guy like Adam Thielen, for example. And then on the back end there, Joe Hayden is, I don't want to say he's washed because he's one of my favorite cornerbacks, but he has not been very good over the last couple of years in Cleveland. He did not play well during his first week with Pittsburgh, which is somewhat to be expected, but regardless. And then also on the back end, they also have Artie Burns, who is a second-year player out of Miami that I think a lot of people were suspicious when Pittsburgh drafted him as high as they did. I thought that Mackenzie Alexander, honestly, was going to be their pick at that point in the draft, but they took Artie Burns.
That was my mock draft pick, too, was Steelers getting Mackenzie.
Yeah, so secondary is suspect, just like New Orleans, and the offense is great, just like New Orleans. This is kind of just a ramped-up version of what we saw last week as far as I'm concerned. So that about wraps up the show for today. Like I said before, we'll be talking more Pittsburgh Steelers. I'm giving you the final updates heading into Sunday's matchup with Pittsburgh, and anything else that comes up, we'll discuss that on the next show here. So look for that on Friday morning. Thanks as always for listening to us. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, VikingsTerritory.com as always, Google Play, pretty much anywhere you look. The About the Labor podcast is probably there in some capacity. So thanks as always for listening, folks, and we will catch you later on this week.